for the sake of time, I'm going to keep the presentation quite short. And I'm going to apply it to a different area than I usually talk about our applications to Zambia and input subsidy programs. I'll talk about a different application, which is to systematic land titling regularization in Nigeria. I want to say at the outset that, first this originally emerged through support from PIM, but also support from USAID through their food security project, and working with colleagues from Michigan State University and Pretoria. And that it's not necessarily an overarching political economy framework. It's more of a policy process framework in which we incorporate political economy dynamics to some dimensions of it. And the overarching motivations is, I think, like many of us in the room and the other presentations we heard, was that we want to get some type of meaningful policy change, right? We want to identify where are the entry points to have policy change, but that often requires, understanding the underlying drive, the underlying interests, ideas, and institutions in a particular policy domain, and how those contributed to some policies being selected over others. Why do some get on the agenda, others don't? Why are some policies implemented and to a greater extent than others? And then why are some become very entrenched? These become, the status quo, and others are much more amenable to reform. And we know, these questions are relevant to public policy globally, not just to the developing world. Most of the conceptualizations of the policy process, a whole spectrum. A lot of them can be too simplistic and quite linear. And then there's many that are quite complex. Lots of diagrams, arrows going everywhere. And it can become too context specific to get to some generalizable findings. And so, some who've been kind of opposed to political or policy process research have brought this up, that it's so context specific. How can you get generalizability? And so we were kind of targeting something in the middle, going for some medium range theorizing that allows for dealing with this concept of equifinality, which means that there can be more than one way to getting to a certain outcome, that, it's not going to all be do X, Y, and Z, and you get A. So we have this Kaleidoscope model that we inductively derived from a pretty extensive review of political economy and policy process literature across different domains: land, health, education, nutrition. We thought that was really key because, as we kind of heard a little bit in Shamiko's presentation, these different domains, some have short-term impacts, some have long-term impacts, some need multi-sectoral coordination, others don't. So looking across these different domains, what seem to be common factors that consistently emerge? And so we derive these 16 key variables that are in the kind of light-colored area of the circle that seem to come up consistently across different literature that we reviewed. The outer circle that has the gray, this is the kind of non-exhaustive list of other factors that seem to come up, may be important in this country, it's not important in this country, may be important for nutrition, it's not really important for education. But they can often feed into some of these more proximate drivers of policy change in the center. And then we deductively then try to test the relevance of these variables in different country settings and in different policy domains, nutrition, land, and input subsidy programs. And we call it the Kaleidoscope model just simply because, these things in the middle, they're always relevant throughout the policy process, whether you're talking about agenda setting or adoption or implementation, but they seem to play a more pronounced role in some aspects of the policy process than others. So just as you have like a kaleidoscope and you shift it and you still have the same pieces of colored glass there, but the light kind of refracts on it and emphasizes a different pattern. So we looked at this in a number of domains, as I said. With respect to systematic land titling regularization, or SLPR, in Nigeria, an interest we had was why there has been differential implementation of this titling approach across states, where it had already emerged on the policy agenda. So one advantage of the Kaleidoscope model is that you can pick the pieces apart. If you're just interested in why something got on the agenda, you can just look at that agenda setting element. But if you're interested in kind of getting all the way to implementation aspects, it can help parse through why you're seeing such variation. And we came up with kind of a measurement of implementation. We had 6 components of becoming more advanced in terms of actually getting to this titling approach being operational. And what came out from looking at this was that Kano State, as you can see, has kind of yes in all these rows here. It's been the more advanced with its SLTR program, and the program is still ongoing. Other countries where it first got on the agenda, like Ondo State, where you saw a lot of momentum at first, and then you see this kind of haphazard efforts at implementation. And as of now, the program's on hold. So we saw quite a bit of variation across these states, and so we wanted to know why that was. So I'll just use that application to then walk through these components of the Kaleidoscope model. First, why did this issue of land governance forum even emerge on the agenda in the first place in Nigeria? And more broadly, when we talk about agenda setting, this is quite a common framing about recognize relevant problem, focusing events, and powerful advocates. This is similar to Kingdon's multiple streams approach, where you have a window of opportunity, where you have kind of advocacy coalitions that help target a critical problem. So, as Eric alluded to, sometimes the problem is not always recognized. You may have different conceptions of the problem. So that's the first thing. I mean, you need to have this, commonly recognized problem that's often iterated through research, bodies of research that kind of repeatedly note that something is an issue. Focusing events, we know these can be droughts, it can be cyclone, it can be political change, as Sarah was talking about. Something that kind of creates a window of opportunity to get something on the agenda. And then powerful advocates, powerful in terms of politics, in terms of votes, in terms of finance, in terms of voice. You can have strong unions or associations. And so in the Nigerian case, the kind of recognized relevant problem, it's repeated often when you read about lands in Nigeria. Only 3% of the land is titled, and you had this Land Use Act invoked in 1978 under the military government, under Obasanjo, which basically gave all the rights to the governors over surface land. And it's been widely shown for a number of reasons that the governors have abused this. It's contributed to widespread land tenure insecurity and informal land markets. The focusing event was basically the elections in 2000. These were the first democratic ones without Obasanjo. If you know a little bit of Nigerian political history, after being a military leader, then Obasanjo ran as a Democrat in 1999. He put this Land Use Act in the Constitution, so it couldn't actually be revoked. It's very difficult to amend something in the Nigerian Constitution because of the federal system and how it's set up. And then the elections in 2007, first ones without Obasanjo running. His PDP candidate was President Yar'Adua. On the campaign trail, he became a really powerful advocate for land governance reform. He made amending the Land Use Act one of the 7 points on his 7-point agenda. And he established, once he was elected, he established this Presidential Technical Committee on Land Reform in order to come up with some type of modality to help improve land titling. So the second component of the Kaleidoscope model then talks about design issues. We can know that we need to get something on the agenda, like climate smart agriculture, for example. But there still can be a lot of discussion about what's the solution, what's the right design for the solution. And so the Kaleidoscope model focuses, again, on 3 factors here. One is parsing through the research that's out there. What are researchers and other sources of knowledge pointing to as a potential solution? Of course, we need to recognize that we have empirical evidence, but we also are influenced by our own personal norms and biases and ideologies. And that very much colors how we interpret evidence, how we interpret research. And then we, of course, have our cost-benefit calculations. So some designs, you think about subsidy programs or healthcare programs. Should you have a targeted subsidy, a universal subsidy? There's costs and benefits, both economically and politically, that need to be taken into account. So in the Nigerian case, knowledge diffusion and a lot of research that was going on about Rwanda very much influenced this Presidential Technical Committee on basically advocating for systematic land titling regularization as the solution. They're very much influenced by, some of the successes in Rwanda. Thailand, South Africa was also experiencing this. And there wasn't really, as we learned from our field work, they really didn't consider anything else. They had heard about the successes in Rwanda, very different country, very small, not federal, motivated by the aftermath of the genocide, so very different context, but they decided this would be the modality. The National Institute of Surveyors was very much opposed to this SLTR. It involves using general boundaries instead of fixed boundaries, and using satellite mapping, and using kind of physical markers like trees, rocks, etc. It's much less costly, which was why it was advocated. But it of course contradicts the training of the surveyors, who are very much focused on doing proper land surveys on the ground. So they were very much had this bias against it, but were ultimately convinced by the Surveyors Council of Nigeria. And then, as I just mentioned, the cost-benefit calculations. This was kind of chosen by the PTCL because it was seen to be a much cheaper way of titling than using fixed boundaries. For adoption, and this is where more the political economy comes through, is of course who are the winners and losers. And what type of voice do they have in the policy process? So we always need to think about getting something. You've got something that's gotten on the agenda. There's been some consolidation of thinking about what the proper design is, but how do you actually get it adopted? And so we need to think again about who are these opponents and proponents, and these government veto players that were alluded to earlier. Veto players are kind of, as your political will approach says, is the kind of sufficient set of actors that you need to have on board in order for something to go forward. And if any of these actors are not on board, then it can often stall, right? And so this government vetoes approach lets us get away from being, well, do you have a democracy or autocracy? Do you have a parliamentary or presidential regime? Do you have a federal or unitary regime? You just need to know, whatever those institutional actors are, who are the number of veto players you need to be thinking about. And then propitious timing, this just as with the agenda setting, with the adoption, it could be something about the electoral calendar, the legislative calendar, the budget calendar, that gives the opportunity for something actually getting adopted to have greater feasibility. And so you really had quite powerful proponents of SLTR in Nigeria. The donors, DFID in particular, was a key donor. They had been the main donor in Rwanda. And again, we're thinking about the successes they had in that case. This PTCLR, which had presidential legitimacy and weight and was embedded in the presidency. And you had a lot of agribusiness industries that really wanted to take advantage of commercial farming and have proper titling, including allied industries and a lot of Aliko Dangote's industries, including kind of rice milling that he wanted to do in Jigawa state. And so this is just a picture of the PTCLR. It visited quite a number of states to try to get traction with the SLTR. Government veto players here, essentially because the Nigerian constitution does give control over surface land as a non-concurrent responsibility to the states. You really needed to get governors on board. And many of the governors who you saw support this either had formerly been ministers of land, had some training in land issues, had been former survey generals, or they had a big agenda over improved revenue mobilization and investment. So the ones that kind of got on board with this had that type of a background. And you saw that where it was adopted, it tended to be right after the 2011 elections, when governors had a kind of longer time horizon to get something implemented before the next elections. Now, for implementation, we know it's not surprising, you always need the budget to implement something. If you don't have the money, even though you've got the policy, it's not going to go anywhere. You need institutional capacity, and that's twofold. That's not just human resources and technical skills, but it also includes the more kind of administrative framework. Do you have the coordinating mechanisms, both vertically and horizontally, if that policy domain requires it? Implementation veto players are the actors that you need to have on board to actually get something done, right? These are your frontline service providers, your street-level bureaucrats. These can be the private sector. If we think about input subsidy programs, you need to get the private fertilizer companies to actually be willing to deliver the fertilizer, even if the government has a subsidy program. And then finally, you need this kind of continued commitment of policy champions. These are individuals who are quite high level, who help make sure that there's attention to an issue, even when other crises or priorities come on the agenda, or administrations change. And we saw in our work that only Kano really had sufficient internally generated revenue. It has about twice the share of internally generated revenue as the other states that adopted SLTR. It was the only one that had more than DFID really on board. The European Commission also contributed about $3 million for the program, and so that was really quite essential for it to move forward with implementation. In all the states we looked at, technical skills and human resources were quite low. You had to see other ministries or the local government administration seconding staff in order to implement SLTR. Very little technical skill using digital land registries. So that was quite common everywhere. But what you did see was different, and particularly in a place like Kano and also Jigawa State, is that where states, there was an issue with bureaucratic autonomy. And so basically where bureaucrats were sidelined by consultants that were brought in by the donors, or where the governor created a new administration, the bureaucrats had very little incentive to help implement this SLTR. They were basically sidelined in the policy process and had very little interest. And of course, that has long-term implications for sustainability once the consultants leave. And then this commitment of policy champions. This was common in all the states except Kaduna. You had the Surveyor General, Commissioner of Lands, or governors continue to be champions in the program, all except in Kaduna, which, as you might recall from the first slide, had some of the worst implementation of the program. And then with many reforms, you have this constant, they're not just one-off, right? You're constantly revisiting, refining these over and over. And with the SLTR, and more generally, when we talk about the Kaleidoscope model, we saw kind of three issues always coming back to inform this evaluation and reform. One is, of course, new research comes out, or you have journalist reports, whistleblower reports. You can think about some of these subsidy programs where they talk, you'll hear about, ghost people on the registers, or you see that, switching to an e-voucher didn't have the impact it was intended to. So you have kind of new information and beliefs that emerge. You have changing material conditions, right? You have a debt crisis, some type of other financial crisis that might undermine the resources for implementation. And then institutional shifts. The minister leaves, the president leaves. You don't have the same type of institutional support or architecture in order for the reform continue, or you have even a more supportive institutional architecture. It can go both ways. And so in the Nigerian case, what was found was that even in a place like Kano that was able to implement this, the cost of these certificates of occupancy that come out of the titling program were still quite high for many, particularly farmers, to be interested in paying for those. And you saw very low demand across all states, actually, for certificates of occupancy. So places like Kano had to rethink what should the pricing structure be in order to actually create a demand for this reform, because there was actually very little smallholder demand for this land titling approach. In one of our other states, Ondo, that has had to put the program on hold despite being one of the first, along with Kano, to be selected, the decline in oil prices caused Ondo to default from its memorandum of understanding with DFID, which then pulled out its consultants, and the FAO pulled out its technology for the titling program. And then elections in 2015, gubernatorial elections, halted the momentum in states that elected a new party, which is not so surprising, but it does explain, particularly in our case of Kaduna, why this new government, El Rufe, was just not as interested in the SLTR approach, very much still believed in the fixed boundaries approach for titling. So that's just an application of this broader model. And we do have a variety of tools to help replicate using such a model. Kind of a measurement table, so building on Eric's emphasis on having kind of clear measurements and hypotheses. So we have a measurement table that helps think about what's the hypothesis. And now if you're out doing your own semi-structured interviews or focus groups, how you could try to measure that through the discourse analysis. Policy chronologies are really critical in order to see what's precipitating what. And here I'm just taking an example from the input subsidy in Zambia, where we take, on kind of the top of the timeline, we take the kind of political or economic larger events going on in the country, while the bottom deals with program or project-specific events that are going on, to see, to what degree some of these broader political economy events influence the other ones. Policy domain mapping helps, particularly if you're looking at project level, like an input subsidy program, but also a titling program. What are the key actors involved throughout the process? Policy formulation, administration, oversight. And so we break it down by national and subnational actors, because you've got the policy adapted at the national level, but it's your district government or your state government that's the one that actually has to implement. And this sometimes allows to see where there's problems with accountability in the project. One actor that's reporting to multiple masters, in a sense. It can also, tell you who has the most power based on where the finances are flowing, and sometimes who's being left out, which policy actors kind of being left out of a decision-making position. And then circle of influence graphics, they help you get a sense of both kind of interest and power, and how an actor that moves over time can help, this is Jean saying with his hands, can help you see why policy might have changed over time. So here again is with reference to it was looking at why the e-voucher in Zambia had gotten on the agenda in 2013, but then didn't get implemented until mid-2015, and what shifted in that constellation, where you kind of had presidential shifts, and you finally got the kind of Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock to support it by then. And then the last tool we have, it's basically, we call it a hypothesis testing table. If any of you are familiar with qualitative comparative analysis, it's kind of called a truth table, where it's similar to almost econometrics, where you're thinking, is this variable present or not? And that kind of helps you understand to what extent that variable played a role in the outcome that you're looking at. And this can be used for, any type of framework that we're talking about. It doesn't just need to be limited to the Kaleidoscope model. So the Kaleidoscope model offers some potentially predictive, it's more kind of correlational analysis, and a kind of a framework where you can think about, was this present or not, and help you understand, why some policies get adopted but never implemented. And it offers this opportunity for controlled comparative analysis, whether you're talking about the same policy in different contexts, or different policy domains in the same country. So the work we've done on Zambia, we've looked at input subsidies and micronutrient fortification in Zambia, and so why you saw such different kind of outcomes in those policy domains. And then finally, it helps integrate what I was alluding to earlier with political economy. You have these sharp schools of thought about institutions, interest, or ideas being prominent. So it helps kind of integrate, I think, like all of the presentations we heard today, as well as the weight of both external actors like our donors and our domestic actors.